The Mental Health Series is brought to you by Micro Gains and Dominion Strength. Both are longtime friends and sponsors of the Barbell Logic podcast, and neither hesitated for a second in wanting to sponsor a series that they know is incredibly important to so many people. Both companies are true small businesses, American-owned, and 100% of all their products are made here in the United States. You'll hear more about that later in the show. For the finest quality fractional plates, visit microgains.com. That's with a Z, microgains with a Z.com. And for the highest quality leather belts, go to dominionstrengthtraining.com. Both use discount code LOGIC for a significant discount off their products exclusively for Barbell Logic listeners. You're listening to Barbell Logic, brought to you by Barbell Logic Online Coaching, where each week we take a systematic walk through strength training and the refining power of voluntary hardship. You're listening to the Barbell Logic podcast. I'm Matt Reynolds. I'm here with my good friend, Dr. David Puter, psychiatrist, my own personal counselor, therapist, friend, coach, client. I'm saying all the words I'm not supposed to say. You're just my buddy. You're my buddy.
I officially coach you. There's a difference. Therapy is like,
okay, that's fair.
You focus on depression and anxiety,
right.
and coaching can be like focusing on just achieving goals, accomplishing things,
that makes
overcoming.
More sense. I definitely don't struggle with depression. First off, this is the mental health series, and this mental health series really is sort of a best of Dr. Puter for the Barbell Logic podcast. We've got previous episodes we've recorded with you and sort of put them in a single series, and then also have 3 new episodes coming out, and this is the one that you're doing with me, and you are passionate about talking about grit, which I thought would make a great episode for the mental health series. And so you and I have talked about this offline many times about the effect that strength training has on our clients. And grit it's interesting. I was thinking, I don't know how many times I've used the term grit on the podcast, but I don't think it's very many times. And yet I think in this short little 4-letter word, it really sums up the kind of thing that we're talking about that is a wonderful benefit of strength training. So when you say grit, what are you talking about? Just so we can set the tone, make sure that we're all on the same page.
Yeah, so it's perseverance and passion for long-term goals, having deep commitment and sort of direction for many years. Actually, it's very, if you look statistically, it's pretty much the same thing as one facet of the big 5 personality types called conscientiousness. There's this thing called the jingle-jangle fallacy, in which 2 different words you think are 2 different things, but actually probably these are both the same thing. So achievement, striving, and conscientiousness.
Wait, are you saying jingle and jangle are the same thing?
So the jingle-jangle fallacy refers to an erroneous assumption that 2 different things are the same or different, right?
Oh, okay. I got it.
So 2 different words could be describing the same thing, or the same word could be used to describe 2 different things, which is the jingle-jangle fallacy.
I gotcha. That makes sense.
Okay. So, I don't want to get into the weeds of the statistics, and I could talk about the science, and that's probably more of the part that people are going to start glazing over. But essentially in the big 5, part of what I do for coaching is we'll go through the big 5 and we'll go through the gold standard. And one of them is achievement striving, which is, striving to achieve and be excellent in what you do, working hard towards your goals, clear about your goals, driven to get ahead, sticking with plans. And this is the same thing as grit, essentially.
Okay. It's weird. When I think about grit, I often think about those things, but with a sort of overlay of a tension or a battle that occurs within those, right? I think it's easy to fight for your long-term goals when everything is going well.
Right.
And I don't think of that as grit. I tend to think of, and maybe I think of it a little bit incorrectly, I think of grit as I'm fighting for my long-term goals in spite of or irregardless of the circumstance, right? Even when it's hard, I'm fighting for the long-term goal. I'm fighting for the achievement. I'm digging in deep to try to get to the place I'm trying to go. And I think everybody can do that when it's easy. When the marriage is good, when the job is good, when the money is good, when, you're not stuck at home with COVID. But it's actually when all of those things, or even just one of those things, start to rise up, that's when I tend to see at least what I think of as grit. Is that fair, or is that putting a different spin on what grit actually
Yeah,
is?
no, it's resilience in the face of failure. When time gets tough, what happens to you in the midst of it? And I was thinking about this in terms of really the hero's journey. And I think that's where this kind of comes alive to me a little bit, because, if you're listening to this and you're like, well, yeah, I have grit, or there's something that I'm passionate about that I've been pursuing for years, most of your listeners already have that to some degree. But maybe some of them feel like, they've kind of been thrown into something like a job or a situation, and then they start to think like, I'm kind of in water here that's deeper than I thought. It's overwhelming. It's flooding my boat a little bit.
Yeah.
Yesterday I was just out in my boat, and I'm like, I row. So I do long boats, you go up and down the slide. So you use legs, you don't just use arms. And it was really windy, and water started to come into my boat. And I was estimating, could I get across to the still water before enough water came into my boat that I couldn't proceed anymore?
That
right?
you sink. Right. And by the way, I saw the post. You could tell you made a video and posted it on your social media immediately after, and it was still pretty clear. I've learned from you to read your micro expressions.
Yeah, good.
You were kind of scared. You had some anxiety there, right? You could tell, and you said this is the first time. Like, you were a high-level collegiate rower. This is not something that you're doing for the very first time. You're like, that's the first time I've ever rowed where water was coming into my boat, and you could tell that you had a little bit of fear there that this was not going to end well.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things. Is like when I rowed in a single in college, the boat was built for a bigger person and I weighed lighter. And now I'm in this I'm in this boat that the boathouse is loaning to me. My boat from Germany is on its way, and it's a smaller boat. And so I'm heavier. I'm like the heaviest I've ever been, pretty much. And water was starting to come over, and I'm like, oh gosh, like this could go really bad very quickly, because it's like a little bit water gets in, and then your boat kind of sinks a little bit, and then more water is able to get in.
A little heavier, and then a little heavier. That's right.
A little bit heavier, right? Yeah. So I eventually decided I was going to turn around, and these little singles, they're not very balanced. If you don't have your oars flat, they feel very unstable. And it was kind of reminding me of moments of my life where it was, it kind of draws you back into those moments where there doesn't seem to be a lot of hope. You're kind of in a darker place. And when I was a rower, I wasn't the best rower. I showed up to college. I was a wrestler, football player. I was a very good wrestler. Not the best, but I was very competitive in high school. I was surrounded by rowers who had rowed in national team level experiences, sometimes for a decade. Sometimes one guy had even been in the Olympics before, and I'm like this guy who's completely green, never rowed, thought, how hard could this thing be? Well, it turns out it's like swimming, it's like you don't just jump into the pool and swim really well, but just because you have a lot of, strength and you're determined.
Sure.
It's very nuanced. There's a lot of technique. And so my coach put me out in a one-person boat. My third and fourth year of rowing, I was out there in a one-person boat.
You're a high school kid, college?
This is college. This is UC Berkeley under Steve Gladstone. Steve Gladstone is...
So big-time rowing school.
Steve Gladstone has won the most national championships in the world ever. Okay, so he's the elite college coach, and that's why I was attracted to go there. But he stuck me on a one-person boat. So, you usually row 8-person boats. So there's 8 people in a boat. There's a little coxswain. And he stuck me out in a one-person boat, and he said, teach yourself how to row, because in the single, you kind of get the feedback a lot more easily. You get this boat feel.
Sure. The instability kicks in, things that you can sort of probably lean on the other 7 guys when you're not as
When
skilled,
there's 7 other guys, you don't really know how you're impacting the boat. But when you're in a one-person boat, it's instant feedback.
Right.
So he felt like I needed this sort of boat feel. A lot of European rowers start in a single for years, and they get that boat feel naturally, like you would if you were a kid learning a basic skill.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like I was in this competitive world where you would stack three 8-person boats up against each other. And then now I'm put in this 1-person boat where I'm literally making my own, like I'm completely self-guided. There's no coach. It's just me all alone in a 1-person boat for months and months and months every day, 2 hours a day. And I'm like trying to figure it out. Right. So I think I'm bringing up this story because you can be in this sort of clan-like situation where the clan is driving you forward, where you feel the competition because you're in this like group. And then when you're all alone, it's like, it's a different type of toughness. And I remember thinking about quitting really seriously before Christmas.
Yeah.
This was my senior year, right? This is my last year of rowing. I got put back in the 8s for like one practice right before Christmas. And right after it, the next day I got put back in a single, and I went up to my coach and I'm like, hey, what's up? I think I'm ready. And he just cusses me out and he says, Pewter, I'm just going to say how he said it. He said, Pewter, you're one of the fucking strongest people on this team, but your rowing is shit. Teach yourself how to fucking row. And he just storms away.
Right.
And I'm like, kind of devastated. I'm like, should I just quit this, and spend the next 6 months doing something that I could be good at? Like, and maybe that's a good question, right? Like at some point, if you're in a failing business, like maybe it's okay to have this question of like, is this the right thing for me to be doing?
Sure. But you stuck with it.
But I stuck with it. I decided actually.
Why do you think you stuck with it?
There was something in me that I was like, I think if I were to do this twice a day, I would get better. So I actually took a lighter load my last semester. So I only had like 3 pretty simple classes instead of, I was thinking about 5, so I just took the minimal load, and I would go out every morning with the team, and then I would go out every afternoon.
Just by yourself?
Just by myself. And eventually I had this coach that wanted to build like a national team, like post-collegiate national team out of Cal. So they were interviewing these coaches, and one of these coaches took me out washboard. He had taken other people to the Olympics in a single. And so he took me out one day. So the oars kind of like go over top of each other. So one oar is on top of the other oar, and I had it backwards.
Yep.
So I was doing some goofy stuff, and he like instantly made some changes and, like gave me just a little bit of coaching, and it made a huge difference. After I got out, he said, don't change who you are. You're one of the most coachable people I've ever coached. And he was just so encouraging. And I felt like this like burst of like hope,
Sure. But it's weird because you actually still had the grit to get through the hard part, right? Like to even get to that spot, right? Where there was like the light at the end of the tunnel, or it started to become enjoyable again. There was this time period where it was rowing as a team sport. They pulled you essentially off the team and made it an individual sport for you for a while.
Yeah.
Right? Like you're in your own boat, literally sink or swim, like swing or row, sink or row. That's what you had to do. And for whatever reason, you decided that you had the grit, you had the determination that in the midst of the adversity, when it probably would have been much easier to quit, you decided to stick with it and do the thing. And then you went on to have this continued successful career with more ups than there were downs. But it seems like in hearing you tell that story, and I haven't heard the full version of that story before, this is the first time I've heard it, that there was this time that was really very much a valley for you, right? It was,
so if you think about like these journeys that we take in life, I think it's helpful to think about like the kind of the call. And within the call, there's like this moment, the belly of the whale moment that we have, this kind of like dark night of the soul, this like time where, we're coming up against our fears, all of the unconscious stuff. So maybe our shadow. And I see this as like cycles actually throughout our life, so like, for example, I could tell you cycles like this that happened in wrestling for me, where I kind of came up against this sort of, belly of the whale moment. And it was kind of like coming to a point where I was like, okay, I'm just going to give this 100%. And if I fail, I'll be happy that I just gave it 100%. And,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
I eventually got put in the fours. I was stroking the four, which means I was kind of like setting the pace of the four. We won the Pac-10s, and that year we went on to get second in the nation.
Nice.
We were rowing very, very well. We were not the top four guys on the team. You know, the four is not like the top boat, but we lost that year to Stanford, which is painful, but at the same time, it was their top four guys. So it was like, it was a boat that had competed and kind of, you know, those top four guys had been in an 8 that had like taken some wins from our top 8. So these were like high level guys that went on to be in the national team.
Yeah.
And so I was very happy with where we finished that year. I felt like we had raced the best we possibly could. So even getting second, you know, there's part of me that's like our mentality at Cal was national championship or nothing, you know? So,
right. Sure.
So we won a team national championship. All of our boats did so well that we actually as a team won the national championship. So in some ways I won the national championship, but our boat took second. But it was like, it was a climactic end to what was a very sort of difficult season of my life.
Yeah. So you just got back into a boat for, I mean, you've been able to do this for a long time. You just moved across the country. You're in Florida where you can actually get into a boat. You've got lake waters out there and much calmer water. You can't get out and row, I assume, in the Pacific Ocean, like the way you can in Florida. So you've started to do that. But what's interesting to me is, and what I'd like to hone in on a little bit is that for the last several years, you've really focused on strength training. And can you tell me why and really relate it back to this idea of grit? And we've talked about this in previous podcasts, and certainly our listeners will hear you talk about the benefits of strength training and the way you've been able to use it with your clients over the years. But interesting that a guy comes out of this rowing background. You are 40-ish, right? Early 40s? What are you?
I'm 37.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Dang it. I'll do it again. What are you, in your late 30s?
30. Oh, it's all good. It's all good.
37 years old.
I'm an old soul is what people tell
That's
me.
Right.
Because like...
That's right. It's just the wisdom. You don't have the wisdom of a guy in their 30s. You have a wisdom of a guy in their 60s.
Well, I think I grew up too quickly, honestly, because of life events.
Didn't have a childhood?
Just, you know, you learn about stuff way too young.
Okay.
Like just horrible things.
I was just never a kid. I don't know if you and I have ever talked about this in our coaching, but I never enjoyed kid things as a kid. Sports I did, but sports I wouldn't really classify as a kid thing. Like I never played with G.I. Joes and I never watched cartoons. And I would get up early in the morning and turn on Ag Day because it was before the news came on, even though like I didn't live on a farm and didn't have any farming in my family. I just thought it was interesting to watch like the price of pork belly and corn. I'm talking about when I was 3, Peter, not like when I'm 13.
Okay.
And I don't even know why. I just watched Ag Day and then the news would come on and I would sit down crisscross applesauce in front of the big wooden box TVs from the, early mid 80s. And yeah, I remember my brother wanting to play G.I. Joes and stuff. Just wasn't ever my thing. I was very competitive and loved sports and played sports. But so you got into strength training and saw the grit, I guess, that it developed in you first and then started to understand the impact that could potentially have on your clients. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that sort of the direction that it went?
I think strength training is just another way to come up against something that is difficult, but it's obtainable at the same time. It's like, I'm guessing that most of your listeners have squatted and deadlifted.
I would hope.
We're not just talking about bicep curls. Like bicep curls are pretty easy. You can do a lot of those and not feel, but when you talk to people who have lifted for a while in the gym, there are those guys that never do legs because doing legs is difficult.
Right.
It's like
the most hard. I'm sitting here, by the way, with very achy knees this morning.
Okay.
From squatting heavy last week. Andrew and Nikki were in staying with me. And I did, for me, again, I'm old and beat up. I squatted 405 for 5 last week. And my knees are just aching. And I want to be clear, it's not my knee joints. It's not that it's not arthritis in my knees. It's the muscles and the tendons around my knees are like, bah. It's been a long time since you put that sort of stress on me. It's hard. It's hard to do the thing. I also remember in the last rep or two of that heavy set of squats, and I realize like we've got listeners listening who are like 405 for 5 is not very heavy. And you're right, it's not very heavy. But for old man Reynolds who needs double hip replacements, it's pretty heavy. The pressure that I felt in my face in the last 2 reps, I haven't felt that in a long time. It was weird. It was very reminiscent of what I used to feel in my competitive powerlifting and strongman days. I feel like where you can't really see them the last, the last. I don't mean to describe that in sort of a bad way. Or it wasn't scary. It was more like, okay, I remember what this. It's been a long time since I've forced my body to feel something this hard, and I came out. I felt great. And I don't feel bad today. I just feel like I'm old enough that I can feel it in my muscles and tendons are still a little bit like, poof, we got to have some recovery here. Like, okay.
Let me mention this other kind of idea concept that I've been really thinking about in terms of like mental toughness grit is like you're on the verge of dissociation at that weight. Like if you stop fighting, if you stop that fighting sort of warrior impulse, right? The courageous warrior impulse and dissociate, you will go weak.
Yeah.
The weight will drop. And like when I'm squatting, it's like there's something about squatting in particular. Deadlifting, you can just drop the bar, and that feels
some
very
safety
safe.
net in the deadlift.
But specifically squatting really heavy, it's like you have this.
Like, what are you going to do? Not come back up?
There's this moment towards the third and the fourth and the fifth rep where it's like you start to like defocus your eyes a little bit, and you need to sort of grab the here and now.
Yeah.
If you don't, then you'll fail. And so you come up against this area that's very, very close to dissociation. And I think that anyone who's done athletic events can realize moments where they've gone into the dissociation and maybe like it was too overwhelming.
Can you explain really quick when you say disassociation, give us like really practical examples of what that looks like?
It's the same place that people go when they're in a life or death situation, a trauma. Maybe they feel out of body. Maybe they feel like a sense that the world is not real. They're not real. So depersonalization, I'm not real. Derealization, world is not real.
Unable to be present in the moment with the thing that matters then is disassociation, right?
So like one of my clients recently told me that when his doctor gave him a message that he had a heart attack, and the doctor said it was a severe heart attack, he felt like he almost left his body because the message that he got was that I'm going to die. My family is going to lose their father.
Yeah.
I'm not going to see my kids get married. All of these things led him into this state of extreme overwhelm, right? And essentially in sport, you are coming up to that edge. And sometimes I can tell you, like, there's one race in particular where I went over the edge, where I felt like I completely wonked off, right? And it's a horrible feeling.
Sure.
It's a horrible feeling.
This is, you ever watch Wes Anderson movies? You ever seen Royal Tenenbaums?
Could go.
Oh my God, dude, they're so great. So Royal Tenenbaums, they've got 3 supposedly genius kids, and one of the kids, it's played by Luke Wilson, Richie, I think is his name. He is a star tennis player. He's like a junior national champion as a little kid, 12 years old, 13 years old, whatever. And he just has this day where he just completely loses it. And he loses 6-0, 6-0, 6-0. And like he's knocking every tennis ball into the audience, and it's that you can see there's complete disassociation. He can no longer, the guy who had the ability. I remember years ago, for those of you guys that are sports fans, I was at least, I don't watch sports very much anymore, but I was a St. Louis Cardinal fan. There was a pitcher whose name was Rick Ankiel, and he was a great young, like one of the best young pitchers. Had been pitching for 2-3 years and was not too far removed from his rookie year. And he just completely melted down in a playoff game as a pitcher for the St. Louis Cardinals. Meltdown, and never ever was able to come back as a pitcher. Actually went back to the minor leagues and came back as a hitter and an outfielder later. But something happened where he lost it. Exactly what you're talking about. On the world's biggest stage, in the playoffs, on TV, in front of millions of people, he just lost it and had completely disassociated.
And it's unfortunate that he never got back at it.
Yeah.
Because I think with coaching or with therapy, like I can help someone sort of join to their core, like get back to the fighter in them, right? And so I think that that's where sometimes a guide can help. Sometimes that coach, sometimes, it's like after a big failure in a sport, you may need to recycle, you may need to get back, but you have to get back at it. You have to then sometimes reframe what happened. Like I remember after this big loss, my whole team is devastated. All 8 of us are just like completely wiped. And my coach comes over and he yells at the person that steers the boat, the coxswain. And he says, "What the were you doing up at that rate? 38. I told you to come down at a 34. These guys are not ready for a 38. Olympians are ready for a 38, but you have to train. Do what I say." And in that moment, like a lot of us were like, oh, like it reframed our experience and our dissociation. We got out of it a little bit,
Right.
Because we were going down too high. We're going up and down the slide 38 strokes a minute. That's like, you have to train.
Yeah, you couldn't, man. It's not sustainable for you guys.
It's not sustainable like so early in the season when you're rowing at an 18 and a 20 strokes per minute. So,
but it's odd, even the way you worded that, it was interesting. The way what I heard you say from him was that he also didn't act as if you would never be able to get there. There was something like in the way he said it. It's like, you're not there yet. And probably some of you recognize that you wouldn't ever be there, but he also probably recognized that there were guys on that team that would eventually get to be at that point. So it was like it reframed like, hey, this is not who you are and not who you are yet.
right.
And I know where you are. I know where your level is. It's like a strength coach, right? If you don't have the strength coach, sometimes you walk into the gym and you get greedy and you're like, I don't know, I could put another 50 pounds on the bar and just see it. And sometimes we even get that. Our clients do that. And you're like, why did you do that? I didn't, like, we know where you're at. We know what the stress needs to be to recover and adapt. And so interesting that he said it that way, because it was this like, hey, you're just not ready for that yet.
Right. So it's like, what I'm saying is that there's this journey that we take. So like within barbell sports, I think you're on this journey as well. A good coach will take you to the limit of some of that psychological ability where you could dissociate if you lost your focus, if you lost your concentration. But if you come to the limit of it and push through and you have moments like that, I think that's what builds the toughness.
Yeah. The refining process. Yeah.
So you can see this in like kids sports. Like for me, like taking my kids to the point where it's like they're almost about to dissociate and getting them to fight through. And my kids are like 4 and 6. It's like intuitively in me to do that to them over and over again.
Of course.
To make them tougher.
And how important is it that they experience what losing feels like? Like, how awful is it that we've created this culture where sports are A, often never hard, and B, there's
no cost.
There are no winners, and there's no cost. There's nothing. It's just like everybody gets a trophy. And listen, like, I get it. I'm a dad, like my daughter's playing softball right now, and I'm going to praise her and encourage her. And also some of it is the personality of the kid, right? She needs encouragement. She doesn't need somebody to be like, that wasn't a very good at bat in the 3rd inning. That's not what she needs to hear. And she needs to understand, like, that's a life lesson to learn when you lose. It's a life lesson when you make a mistake. And it's not about getting in trouble or being punished. It's about learning how to deal with the thing, or to push yourself to the point of, when you're in sports and it's really hard conditioning. You never run that hard, or you've never made your heart race that hard before. You've never played that hard before. Like, those are things that humans need to dip into.
Right.
And I think what we're going to get to in the podcast here is that it's odd that when we force ourselves to do those things in these kind of voluntary ways that we understand or not, it's not like going to war, and it's not like, but you do these things on a daily or weekly basis, that you have to do a thing that's very, very hard to push yourself right to the physical limit, and then choose to fight through it. And oh, by the way, sometimes fail, and then have to learn how to deal with the failure. It's interesting the way that then starts to play out in your normal life when it's not the thing that you choose to have to go through.
Yeah, 100%. So that's what I think, that your ability to push through translates to other domains of life.
Yes.
Which is why, like, a lot of the ancients said, like, part of education was sport. It was so important in the growth and development of the citizen. And now it's like, I think it's almost like faded in importance,
Yeah.
And I think the people who get it, and the people who are able to sort of journey that, it teaches them lessons that are very important to learn.
Yeah.
How are you going to be in a marriage when a marriage gets tough?
Right.
What happens when your spouse gets ill? What happens when your kids get ill? What happens when money is tight?
There are those things all along the spectrum of like how hard they are, right? So I can't sympathize with the guy who sat in front of his doctor and the doctor said, you just had a massive heart attack. Like, that's a big, big, big deal. But I have noticed things like, I've had, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 surgeries none of which were massive surgeries. Things like appendectomies, kind of gallbladder out, hernia surgeries, things like that. And I've noticed with people, I'm painting with a broad brush here, but I've noticed with people who haven't done hard things, who don't lift, who just don't tend to take their bodies or don't even have the experience of taking their bodies into that place to the edge and figuring out how to push through. The way they approach even things like pretty basic surgeries, which is still kind of a big event for your body, is very interesting. I remember watching my dad approach surgeries in this very melancholy and pessimistic way. Like, oh, I hope this very normal surgery doesn't kill me. Whereas when I would have surgeries, I'd have a hernia surgery or an appendectomy, I would actually kind of set a goal to be like, I'm going to show the world. I mean, I wouldn't say this out loud, but in my head, I'm thinking to myself, I'm going to show the world how fast I can recover from this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that's sort of a good practical view of grit. My dad, I've said this for years, my dad didn't have grit. He didn't have it. I hate that. I love my dad. He's a wonderful human being, loved us, loved mom, but he never taught us grit, never modeled grit because he didn't have grit. He did hard mental things, but he never did anything that was really difficult to fight through.
Here's kind of like, let's say you're a listener and you're saying, I'm not sure I have grit. And there's a story that you're telling yourself. And I would say we have to examine that story and we have to look at that narrative of you telling yourself that you're incapable of doing hard things. And we have to see that you are putting yourself in a narrative of your life that is like a victim. That is not who you could be.
Yeah.
So there's a conspiracy of mediocrity going on in your mind that you have to be a victim. And I would say that that is a testing. It's like, if you can reframe those thoughts of internal critique, those thoughts of, do I have what it takes, as like, those are part of the trials that everyone goes through. And you just have to realize, like, you can see yourself as someone who is being tempted to believe that they're a victim, but you don't have to be a victim.
Yeah.
You're tempted to believe that you don't have a choice in your life. But even like Viktor Frankl, who's in a concentration camp.
Who is a victim
to horrible circumstances.
Yeah.
He had a quote that said, "We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." And so if you are believing the conspiracy of mediocrity, that you don't have a choice, then you're believing a false narrative. Yeah. Everyone has a choice. There's things that you can control, right? There's a Stoic belief that we should focus on the things that we can control and accept the things that we can't control, the externals.
Yeah.
But what is the good and evil? The good and evil is not the uncontrollable externals, but within yourself and the choices you have. And there's little steps that you can take to move forward in any domain of life. And there are things that you can control, right?
Yep.
So I see this in marriages. The spouse comes to me and they say, my wife needs to do this, this, and this.
Yep.
Okay, you cannot control your wife.
That's right.
You cannot control your wife's emotion. You cannot control your wife's irritability. You cannot control your wife's upsetness at you. What you can control is your attitude.
Your reaction to.
Is how you're going to show up. Is how you're going to love her. Maybe love is acts of service. Maybe it's quality time. Maybe it's giving her words of affirmation. You can control what you do in that domain. You can't control her reaction. She may be irritable for the first 100 times you compliment her because you were an asshole for many years, sure. Right? But maybe the 101st time she changes, right? But you can't control that. What you can control is your own approach to it.
Have you ever noticed that the smallest weight plates you can find at a gym is 2.5 pounds? One of the things that everyone needs when they're first starting out on their journey of strength is fractional plates. That's plates smaller than 2.5 pounds, so that you can continue to get wins in the gym every single session for as long as possible by adding strength and muscle 1 pound at a time. Mike from microgains.com is a true American-owned small business. All of his fractional plates are super high quality, and all of them are made in Pennsylvania and shipped by the owner himself. So when you support Microgains, you support a real blue-collar American trying to survive and support his family in the midst of a pandemic. There are definitely other fractional plates out there, but none with a story like Mike's. I've used them all, but I use his fractional plates and dumbbell fractional plates literally every single workout. And I'm thankful to have a company of Microgains quality as a supporter of the podcast. For the finest fractional plates on the planet, head over to microgains.com and use discount code LOGIC for 10% off any order. That's microgainz.com and use discount code LOGIC for 10% off any order. So here's what I love about the relationship there with strength training. Strength training is a thing that you have to basically do on your own. Certainly you can have training partners and you can have coaches and you can have things that help maybe ease the load a little bit. But the thing that you're doing in strength training is you're out there all by yourself. Like when it's time to squat that heavy weight, the bar is on your back and no one is picking it up off of you. And what I often see in these life challenges, things like a marriage, right? There are times when if you make a decision that you take marriage seriously and you are going to fight for the marriage, even if you're going to fight for it alone, right? Mm-hmm. Then that's all you can control. Now, it works a lot better if both sides are fighting for the marriage, but I see way too many times, not just marriage, but anything, any of life's struggles, where people sort of set up almost like this contractual obligation that as long as you fight for the marriage, spouse, I'll fight for the marriage. That's a horrible way to look at it. As long as my job is good and I continue to get paid a good salary, then I won't spiral myself into uncontrollable financial suicide. As long as I'm healthy and don't get COVID, then I'll this. As long as nothing is injured or hurt, I'll continue to eat healthy and train. But the problem is that at some point, like those things get, like the things that we can't control come in and throw a monkey wrench in the thing. And then we have to go, well, now how do we control it, right? How do we control the marriage when we find out that the spouse is having an affair on us? How do we control the job when we get a new boss and the boss hates us and is doing everything they can to make us fail? Like, how do we control? And that's where I don't want to make squats sound like it has that level of gravity. It doesn't have that level of gravity. But what it seems to do is it teaches people to learn how to fight. It teaches people to learn how to fight 3 times a week, 4 times a week, and take themselves to that spot so that when they're confronted with these things, they're better able to position themselves in a way that says, I'm not a victim here. It's interesting because I will be vulnerable and honest here. There are times when like not really super important things happen that are kind of minor negative things at my house, maybe with my kids or my wife or around the house or my dog poops on my carpet behind me. I like want to lose my crap over the dog taking a poop on my carpet and like doesn't matter. And my family, you can tell my family gets a little on edge because I'm on edge because the dog pooped on my carpet. And then there's times when like giant things happen, like bad stuff. And you can see my family sort of like gasped to see like, how's dad going to react? And then I'm like, okay, let's just do this. And they're like, wait a minute, well, you get to a point where you're like, I can't control the fact that, that my mentor sued me or that my dad just went to hospice and is about to die or that, we're having a hard time getting into the house. Like there's these things that you go, and I think there's something sometimes about the real gravity of those situations that make you go, okay, here we go. Time to have the grit and fight. It's interesting that a dog pooping on the floor requires 0 grit from me. I just get mad and react. So it's odd.
Well, the dog pooping on your floor, because you're high conscientiousness, you're high orderliness. And because you're high orderliness, you're high disgust.
Right.
Right. And so dog pooping on your carpet is like that disgust response, right? So that's like, because you have high grit and high achievement striving, you also have high disgust towards that.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. It's true.
When there is actual chaos that has entered into your home and the instability, and you are providing the stability in the midst of that, and people feel that, and they calm because of that. Yeah. I remember when I was internal medicine for a year before I went into psychiatry, and I walk into this situation. There was 3 a.m. This person was extreme shortness of breath. They were panicking. The respiratory therapist had been trying for 50 minutes without success in helping this person breathe. I walk in, I look at his legs, pitting edema. I look at him, he's short of breath, he's freaking out. I'm calm. I look at what he's been taking. I say, push an extra 40 milligrams of Lasix IV. And I am so calm because I know exactly what's going on. He had a heart failure and fluid is backing up into his lungs. It's not anything you can change with albuterol. That's what, or the breathing treatments. And so I knew that it wasn't the breathing treatments because they had been giving breathing treatments. And I knew this guy's fluid was building up. And the guy within like 10 minutes had peed out, some fluid.
Right. That gave him the diuretic.
And was breathing a lot better. But I could feel like the tension in the room, like completely change after I walk in and I know what's going on and I give some direction.
Yeah.
And he even calmed down, his breathing calmed down just from knowing that like this, I was clear. This is what's going on. This is what you need. You're going to feel better in 20 minutes to half an hour.
Yeah.
You're going to be okay. And what I was emphasizing there though, is like you are, because of your strength, because of the difficult things that you've gone through, because of your ability to, it's not just like squatting. It's all of those life situations which have brought you to that moment of chaos, right?
Sure.
And you are now the calmest person in the room and everyone feels that and it's contagious and that's leadership.
Yeah. Okay. So I have a question and then a follow-up question to that. The first part of that question is, there have still been times in my life when I do not believe I can go to a time in my life when I had a challenge or a tragedy that was so intense and so in your face that I completely disassociated and sort of shut down. That I see that as the opposite of grit. And I don't know if that's the way you look at it too. That kind of idea of like, I'm so overwhelmed, I can't do it anymore. And you just often sort of just cry and shut down, or maybe you don't even cry. Maybe you literally just go watch Netflix or something because it just completely takes you out of the moment. I can't go to a time in my life when I've ever done that long term. But how common is it in those really intense moments of pain, tragedy, challenges, that even people with very good grit disassociate for a short period of time? Like I've had those times when you describe like the kind of out of body experience, like I'm not living in reality, but it seems to come back within a few minutes and go, okay. And now I sort of regain my logic and reason and go, okay, hold on. Here's what we have to do. And I get that. Is that still fairly common even among the people that you would look at and go like, man, these people have really... So it's not the actual disassociation that occurs, because I think for me, it feels like an involuntary physical response that occurs to it, but that people who tend to struggle with grit or don't have grit stay in that. Whereas people that have developed grit, after a pretty short period of time, they're able to go, okay, here we go. Let's focus and do this thing.
Yeah, I think we all have those moments, right? Where it's like we're starting to feel not connected to our body. There are people who suffer from it for weeks or months at a time. And those people are really struggling.
Sure. You hear about people who have like refused to accept the death of a child or something for like, they just cannot. And I think that, the stats better than I do. I believe that's the most stressful thing a person can go through. Is that right? Or it's up there in the very top?
I think the death of a child is incredibly, incredibly difficult. Absolutely. Especially if it's a suicide.
Right. So for people who can't seem to deal with that, it makes sense.
It destroys marriages. Often marriages will break up over a death of a child.
Yeah.
It's that devastating. Here's the thing is like when it is completely overwhelming and it causes that sort of, it's like a life or death situation, it dissociates you. That can act as like a trauma. And that's where like therapy or talking to someone who's a professional can help you get out of that. And sometimes it can be one conversation. Like I think you've had moments, in the middle of like some of the big transitions and launching your company where you were on the verge of that, right?
Sure.
Where it's like, if I continue to go down this thought process, if I continue to, have this elevated state of arousal that, like I'm on the verge of just kind of this idea of giving up, and I think you just kept fighting and you kept finding resources. I think that's one thing that you've done successfully is you find people, whether it's like coaches or lawyers or, colleagues, right?
I love the lawyer. Yeah, lawyers. They were helpful, but yes. No, yeah, you're exactly right. Surround myself with good people who
who could help you bear the burden.
Yeah.
And I think that's what, if you look at like the hero's journey, any good, the hero's journey is like the kind of the summary of all myths, all great stories.
Big epics. That's right.
There's always this moment where the person doesn't feel equipped to do what is set before him.
Yeah. This is where imposter syndrome kicks in often. You're like, I don't have this in me.
I'm having a call to do this great thing, and I don't feel that I am able. And often there's a guru, a guide who gives them like something, a gift.
Yeah. Wisdom, a piece of something, right?
A special staff, a special cloak, I think it's sometimes necessary to know that that's what you need. So like, for example, when I reached out to you a year ago and I was like, hey, I want you to coach me.
Yeah.
I realized like I was getting to that point where I needed someone to externally construct what I was going to do squatting wise. Cause I had tried this, I'd been doing this for 2 years, I was in the low 300s for a lot of my lifts. But I realized like because of COVID, because of the increased isolation of not having my training partners, because of the other stresses that were uniquely going on, I knew that I needed something extra.
Yeah. So I love the way you're going here. And this is how I'd love to wrap up the podcast, is that for our listeners right now, we've kind of touched on the far ends of the pendulum swing of like, obviously most of the people listening to the podcast here are not dealing with the death of a child or a suicide, or although some have, certainly. But for the people who are struggling, who are listeners who are struggling on that, just, they're overwhelmed with work stress. They're overwhelmed with financial stress. They're overwhelmed with marital or relational stress. And there's a part in them that's saying like, I just want to give up. What are those practical pieces of advice, those takeaways that we can give them to go like, here's a great first step or first couple of steps that you can make to begin to develop grit, to understand the gravity of the situation and figure out how to fight through it rather than disassociate and give up?
Well, first of all, I think a lot of people are at that place right now just because of how COVID has stressed them out. I mean, some businesses have thrived, but a lot of businesses are really struggling and a lot of people are having a hard time. And so there is this sort of aspect of, can you decrease the shame that you internally feel from being in this place where you feel really overwhelmed and stuck, because shame in and of itself keeps us more dissociated.
And how do you do that?
Well, one is just to realize that this is part of the human condition, right? To be in this sort of belly of the whale, to be in this place where you don't feel big enough for what is called before you, right? To feel like this is part of the human condition, to feel in this place where you feel like it's too big for you, right? And then, look around. Like, do you have a guide? Do you have someone? Do you have coaches? Do you have people in your life that can speak to you and that can help you, right? And this is where I get really charged up. And I have a couple spots open for people who need clients, but I'm accepting coaching clients, people who feel like they need some one-on-one type of coaching. And, that's one part that's like very, very helpful. Another is just, can you write down what you actually can control and write down the things that you can't control?
Yeah.
And so make a list, one side and the other, everything that I can't control, everything that I can control. And then with the things that you can control, what are some of the small steps that you can take in each of those domains to create order to the chaos of your life, right? Can you make a list of those things and then start to just chip away at it?
Yeah.
Right? So for example, let's say you're unemployed for the first time in your life because of COVID, and you're like, what do I want to do? Maybe one of the things on your list is make a list of all of the people that you know, like every person that you know, and call them and say, hey, do you know of any jobs in this type of field? Or do you know anyone who does this type of work?
Yep.
Right. And so you will be surprised that like out of your 50 people that you know, one of them will know one person in that type of work. And how do you get a job? You get a job based on people you know, right?
That's right.
That you're more likely to get a job from people you know than just some random search. So something like that could be a small thing.
Well, by the way, we did this in the business. I won't give specifics, but the other day we had a little bit of an overwhelming, urgent, and important situation. Nothing that was negative, just something that had to be dealt with and dealt with relatively quickly and seemed overwhelming. And there are times, I think, if you make the list and the list is 25 or 50 or 100 items long, that in and of itself can also then be very overwhelming. And so you do that. And for me, the way I look at it is when I do that, it gets it out of my head. So there is a place where it lives on paper or on my notepad on my phone or on my computer. But then I go, okay, well, like, what is the most urgent, most important thing that I need to deal with in the shortest amount of time? It's this thing. And then on a completely separate piece of paper, I start a list and go, okay, well, what are the next 3 to 4 things I need to do to attack that one thing? And I don't go back and look at, I love the idea of chipping away at the list, but if the list feels like daunting and overwhelming itself, get it there to get it off your head and then put the list away and identify what's the most urgent and most important thing that I need to do now. And then you go, okay, well, now I've actually just have a list of 3 things that I have to do today. Or that idea of calling all the people that you know for the job. Like if you know 150 people, that's a big daunting list. But what you go is, I think that these 5 people might make the biggest impact. So I'm going to call these 5 people today. And like, that's the list, not how am I ever going to work through this list of 150 people and call them? Right? To me, I think a lot of times that becomes overwhelming for people. So to be able to break it down into digestible chunks into things so that you get a win. I mean, what I'm really looking for there, for me personally, and for my staff that struggle with this sometimes, is I go, well, like, what do we have to do today to get the win? To feel like we accomplished something. And if the list is so giant that's 150 items long and we knock off 3 things, it feels like you didn't accomplish anything. But if you identify that these are the 3 most important and urgent things that we tackle, and we get those done, and that was the goal for today, oh man, today was a win. And then tomorrow we'll focus on the next 3 things.
Yep. Yeah. And maybe it's like one thing on that list is what you focus on until that one thing is done. For me, it's like I have this new teaching platform that I'm building for learning like small moments of emotion, microexpression. And so it's like, okay, what is one small thing that I can do towards that every day? And it's, the things that are the most demanding are the things that I try to do first.
Sure.
So it's like 8:00 in the morning, I have to write, I'm working on this episode. Okay, I'm going to sit down, and that's when my brain is running the best. That's when I'm going to do the most demanding task. And, I know that it's like 2 hours, and then that's the 2 hours I have to work on that.
Yep.
Okay, here's another big thing is to look at victim narratives that you believe. So victim narratives are like the opposite of self-efficacy, the opposite of like, I have free will. It's like when a doctor says to you something like, your joint is bone on bone. And then you put a meaning onto that, okay, of like, I'm never going to be able to lift again.
Right.
So, the meanings that we put on real things, like, okay, I have a little osteoporosis, the real thing of that, and then we put a meaning of therefore, and it's like this really negative sort of thing. So to look at those places, the small places throughout your life where you've put meanings onto things, where maybe it's like the narrative is not accurate.
Yeah.
It's like instead of seeing it as a trial or something you're going to work through or something where there's, the ability to at least choose the way that you're going to think about it, you join this sort of conspiracy of mediocrity where it's like, there's nothing I can do in that domain.
You believe a lie in accepting that this thing has made me who I am. It is now defining me. I'm defined by this bad thing that I interpret as bad.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so when you meet people and they introduce themselves by the bad things going on in their life,
the Debbie Downers,
that's an indicator that that person is living out of their illness.
Yeah.
Okay. And sometimes illness gives people connection with other people.
Yes.
I've had marriages that are falling apart and then one person gets ill and finally the marriage just like reboots.
Yeah.
So illness can give power. It can give connection. So
really quick, one thing that I've always struggled to explain, and I'm hoping maybe in a quick sort of short version of this, I want to be very careful and very sympathetic with the way I even word this, is that I know you are not saying, and that I am not saying, that there are no such thing as victims in the world, that there are horrible things that happen to people, especially that are out of their control. And what I think I'm hearing you say is that even if that's you, even if horrible things have happened to you, you have the right and you have the ability, and maybe it will take a coach or someone to help walk you through that. you have the ability to not let that thing define you for the rest of your life. And I've thought about this before. My biggest fear in life, and probably my whole life, outside of losing a member of my immediate family, would be a member of my immediate family being abused in some way. Like if somebody abused my wife or daughters, and how I would handle that if that were the situation. And of course, I try to think like I would be so mad and I would be so angry and I'd be so sad and I would be hurt for them. And they would absolutely be a victim in going through that. But then how do you navigate the fact that if you do go through something like that, how do you not let it define you for the rest of your life, so that your first thought about yourself is like, hi, my name is Matt Reynolds, or my name is so-and-so. I am someone who's been abused. Like that's a big time thing that I think a lot of people, and again, we're going to this is a very deep, and it might literally just be, hi, I'm so-and-so who keeps getting fired by bad bosses. It might be like, hey, I'm so-and-so who, for whatever reason, my car breaks down and it seems like, the universe is out to get me financially. How do you get out of that? Even when those things really are true, like they really are happening and you really are a victim there, how do you not see yourself as that and be defined by that long term?
I think you first of all decide that despite getting some good things from defining yourself like that, maybe you get some sort of pseudo connection with people, maybe you get some sort of power, maybe, you get people like doctors who give you attention, maybe you get, kind of a psychological out from doing something difficult, so there's things that you benefit from it. So first of all, I think identifying the benefits of accepting a narrative that's like an illness narrative. And then it's finding the realization, though, that because that's not who you are at the core of your being, if that's the only way you connect with other people, you will be feeling lonely. So people want to connect over the positive and the things that are unique about them, the creative aspects, the parts of them that are more true. I think is that courage inside of you that maybe isn't completely manifest. So it's like not accepting that you will connect over illness and that you really do want to connect over your strengths. Now, the difficult thing is, let's say you're in a family system that wants you to be ill.
Yep.
It happens, right?
Sure.
Like you might have an Oedipal mother who wants you to remain infantile and childlike. I had one client just like that the other day. It's like the mother was demanding either no connection with her or that the mother would continue to make all life decisions.
Yep.
It seems silly when you say it out loud, but it happens all the time.
Have you heard this story that we had one that happened here in Springfield? It was a famous national story. It was the Blanchards, Gypsy Rose Blanchard, and they've made several documentaries about it now, of this mom who, she had what was essentially a totally normal daughter, and she basically made the daughter ill, pretended that the daughter was ill, pretended the daughter was mentally handicapped as well as physically handicapped, and the daughter ended up conspiring to kill her mom. She and her boyfriend killed her mom when she was like 17 or 18 years old. And she's in prison now, the daughter, for having killed this. And it was that sort of thing. Like the entire culture of her family was that the mom kept the daughter ill, even though there was nothing wrong with her.
I mean, if you're not in my world, then you might not see this face to face as clearly as I do, but like it's called Munchausen and Proxy, basically, where the mother keeps the child ill in order for their own psychological needs, narcissism, blah, blah, blah.
So I can be the caretaker of my child. I can be the caretaker of my child if my child is always ill.
I've walked into husbands who are doing this to their wife. This one husband, I walk into the hospital and like the first thing that comes out of his mouth, and we're in there for like a completely different, we're like internal medicine team. The first thing is my wife was raped and she was molested and, all these things. And he's just rattling off this list of horrible things that have happened to his wife. And he's doing that with this one-sided smile of pride, as if he is the hero of the marriage.
Right.
He is standing by his wife.
I'm here to save
her all
her
of these things. He is the savior, right?
God.
It's like, it makes me want to vomit.
Sure.
It really does. It makes me want to vomit. So what do we do in that situation, right? How do we, well, first of all, if you are at all accepting that you are a victim and you have this like victim narrative about yourself, that you are like, you are your illness, you are unable to move forward, to not join that conspiracy of mediocrity of that part of your brain that's telling yourself, and maybe get some coaching, maybe get some sort of help outside of it and find, the things that are more true about yourself. The things like, if I'm working with someone like that, I don't shame them for having those thoughts. We accept it. We see how it's been adaptive for them. Shame moves people further away from health, And so it's adaptive to some degree to sometimes have those narratives about yourself, to then, once you move out of that empathy and that acceptance, it's like, yes, but here are my goals. Here is what I want for my life. And some people, it's hard to even palpate those. It's hard to grab those, right? It's so latent inside of themselves that they may need to have a series of questions like, okay, what were the things that you used to desire? Well, I guess when I was a kid, I desired to be an explorer. Okay, there's something about venturing out, seeing the world, experiencing life, which is back then was you until this trauma occurred. And then you sort of, from that point of that trauma, like the baseball pitcher, right?
Right.
He had that horrible game. And then after that, he was a different person.
Yeah.
And the difficulty is, I'm thinking about a lot of my like war vet patients. Sometimes the trauma that happened was something they did.
Yeah.
That was malevolent. It was something evil. In their mind, they saw it as evil. And they have a difficult time talking about it because it was that one thing. It's so shame oriented that they can't even talk about it.
Right. Yeah, there's these things that seem to make people see themselves as victims that are, for many people, the thing was out of their control. But for also many people, the thing was entirely in their control. And so they live in their shame and they live in the like, I was the person who did the thing that was bad that's now impacted my life that way, right? That's the way they see themselves.
Yeah. And so to reframe that as like, you are currently in a belly of a whale. You are like in that Star Wars garbage disposal thing that is starting to close on you. Okay. And there is so much more ahead of you. Like there is a world ahead of you that you don't even know. Your purpose, the way that you are going to help other people. A hero like lives for other people to a large degree. They either give a gift of an idea or helping people physically. Like the capacity for that generativity stage is there. It's just like you're in this sort of belly of the whale moment. And so to realize like you're in a larger narrative, which is played out throughout all great stories, and you still have the capacity, and you might need those Yodas in your life. You might need to start looking for them, right?
Yeah.
And I've found that some people just find YouTube videos that can be inspiring, like the Yoda sometimes is like some person online that they just listen to and they're encouraged by the person. And sometimes it's someone that maybe you're not open to the feedback in the way that you need to be, right? So I think to kind of reframe it as this is the beginning, this is the trial portion of your story. Maybe you haven't even accepted the journey. Maybe you still need to accept the responsibility of living. And maybe you need to see that you're not a victim, that you actually have a choice, that you have self-efficacy, that you have the ability to make movement forward, and that you're in a place that's, a horrible place, but you have this capacity to transcend and move forward and go.
That's good. Awesome, man. I always get so much out of these talks. I love having you on the show because I love it that you can bring value, and I think you do bring a lot of value to our listeners, but I get such tremendous value out of our discussions just personally that I get to sort of scratch a selfish itch having you on the call. So I'm thankful to walk through both. I think we were able to talk through a little bit what this looks like for people who are dealing with being in a really dark place, right? Identifying themselves as a victim or believing a lie about themselves at the deepest level, but also what it looks like practically to attack some of those everyday things that we need to have grit for. We'll never say that barbell training will help you overcome your victimhood from past like tremendous abuse or these terrible, but it is something that we can do to help us learn how to take our body to the limit and fight through the thing that's hard. And by the way, with a pretty good return on investment with sort of low risk, right? I think the world thinks that maybe you can hurt yourself really bad lifting weights, but what we've seen is that the risk of trying to do that new PR set of 5 on squats is actually really, really low. And the return on that investment is very high for us and will help you develop or know what it feels like to develop some of that grit to fight against the thing that's hard.
Yeah. Yeah. I think sport and barbell training in particular can be a very sort of incremental challenge, which is a training tool, not just for your body, but for your mind. The mind and the body are intimately connected.
Of course.
And so you can hear other episodes where I talk about how it's good for depression, how it's good for cognitive function, how it delays cognitive declines, all that stuff. But I think beyond that, it can be part of your journey. And, if you're listening to this and you'd like to connect with me, reach out to me on Instagram, reach out to me on...
I was going to ask, what's the best way for people to get a hold of you if they're interested in coaching from you?
If they go to psychiatrypodcast.com,
okay.
I have like a contact form there.
Perfect.
That's probably the best way, or just shoot me a message through social media. I'm not on Twitter anymore. It could be Instagram or Facebook if you find me there.
Perfect. And we promoted your podcast in the intro to this series, but for more, Dr. Peter, where you really dive and get into the weeds on really just about everything that you could possibly be interested in the psychiatry and psychotherapy world. Your podcast, Psychiatry and Psychotherapy, you can download and listen to Dr. Peter's podcast on anywhere that you listen to podcasts. You can get it on iTunes or Overcast or Spotify or any of those things. And so can't recommend that enough. I'm a picker and chooser of your podcast, right? So one of the things I like about your podcast is that when I see a topic that's really interesting to me and feels like it would be something that I'll benefit from, I'd love to listen to those. And sometimes I see one that's a little more ethereal or academic for whatever reason. Doesn't mean that it's not valuable. I'm sure that it very much is. But what I love about your podcast is those individual episodes are very much good standalone episodes that you don't have to start at the very beginning and work your way through. You're very clear about the topics that you're talking about that day, and they stand on their own.
Yeah, some of the episodes are really just purely psychiatry oriented. Like I do a deep dive on like lithium. It's like if you're not a psychiatrist or someone prescribing meds, you're probably not going to be that interested in that episode. But there are I have a series on the Big Five, which is probably more detailed than you would want to hear. Or I have, a series on therapeutic alliance, like how to connect with other people. Or I have one on psychopathy that I think you liked, where it's like talking about Ted Bundy.
Yeah. Forgiveness episode was great that you did. And you really started your podcast for professionals in the psychiatry world. But do you have any guess on the percentage of people that are listening to your podcast now that are in fact not professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors? If you had to guess what percentage of your listeners are just everyday people that are trying to learn?
So for each of my episodes, I have like a very detailed blog that I go with it, where I have like, a couple 100 citations or so for some of the episodes each. And I have a resource library where you can get like PDFs of these. And so people sign up and then they put like a little note to me or whatever. So I kind of get an idea on who's listening based on those notes. And most of the people who sign up for that are mental health professionals. I would say about maybe 20% are not.
Okay.
I know there are some people who are seeking like their own sort of self-help, and they want to know like what's closest to the actual science, or like, maybe they're depressed and they like want to actually know like, what is the science behind this stuff, and I try to make those episodes approachable.
Yeah, I think they really are. They're easy to understand. We talked once about, you had me on your show to talk about the value of barbell training for mental health as well. So a good crossover episode there as well. Thank you for doing this, man. I'm excited to be able to re-release these episodes and get them back out. I'm proud of the things that we've talked about over the years. And for those of you who listen to it, I hope you take to heart the things that we've said. I probably opened up more in those episodes that we've done over this mental health series over the years with you, and or more transparent than I've been on any other podcast that I've ever done. And I'm actually grateful that I'm able to do that. It feels to me like freedom, not like bondage, to be able to do that. It feels good to be able to just be who I am and talk through those things. And I think a lot of what you talk about and steer people to is towards self-awareness and understanding who you are and how to understand yourself better. And so it's been a tremendous value to me. So thank you for being a consistent guest on our show. And certainly this won't be the last time. It's always great to have you on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks for being on. Thank you all for listening to the Barbell Logic podcast. Again, this mental health series with Dr. David Puter, and you can find him at Psychiatry and Psychotherapy Podcast or at psychiatrypodcast.com. You can reach out to him if you're looking for coaching, he is available. He's got a few slots there as well. If this brought value to you, this podcast series brought value to you, we would love to have a 5-star review on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. That's a tremendous help for us because it helps us in the algorithm to show up for more people and help more people. And so we will see you next week. Thanks for listening.